Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us, click the like button, and let's get into the case. The morning air carried a familiar chill that clung to Michael Barrett's skin as he stood at the edge of Roach Harbor, his kayak resting at his feet. At 45, Michael had spent most of his life on or near the waters of the San Juan Islands. The archipelago off Washington's coast was home, more so than the modest A-frame cabin he maintained in Friday Harbor. His weathered hands, calloused from years of paddling and working as a marine biologist at the local research center, gripped the side of his sleek carbon fiber kayak, a recent investment he'd justified to himself as necessary for his weekend excursions. The overcast October sky promised rain later, but the forecast had indicated a clear morning, perfect for his planned route around the northern tip of San Juan Island. He checked his watch. 6:30 a.m., early enough to avoid most of the weekend warriors who would descend on the harbor later, seeking Instagram-worthy wildlife encounters. Michael knew better than to expect guarantees when it came to wildlife sightings, but secretly he hoped to catch a glimpse of J-Pod, one of the 3 resident orca pods that frequented these waters. The southern resident killer whales were struggling, their numbers dwindling due to decreased salmon stocks, their primary food source. As a researcher who had dedicated his career to studying these magnificent creatures, Michael felt a personal connection to their plight. His colleague and occasional paddling partner, Elena Yamamoto, approached from the parking lot, her own kayak hoisted effortlessly over her shoulder despite her compact frame. "Morning, Mike," she called, her breath visible in the cool air. "Ready to tempt fate?" It was their running joke. Eleanor always teased that Michael's solo excursions were tempting the ocean gods, though they both knew he was meticulously careful. Safety protocols were second nature after 20 years on these waters. "The sea's calm today," Michael replied, glancing at the glassy surface stretching before them. "You still joining for the first leg?" Elena nodded, setting her kayak down beside his. "As far as Speeden Island, then I've got to head back for that meeting with the research grant committee." "Their loss," Michael said with a small smile. "The Northeastern Channel's been active this week. Kyle from the Whale Watch Company texted me yesterday that they spotted what might be a transient group near Boundary Pass." Elena's eyebrows raised slightly. "Transients? That's unusual this time of year. Unlike the fish-eating resident orcas, transient killer whales, now officially called Biggs killer whales, primarily hunted marine mammals. They were less predictable, appearing sporadically throughout the Salish Sea." "That's what makes it interesting," Michael replied, zipping up his dry suit. The black neoprene would keep him warm even if he capsized in the frigid October waters. Kyle said they were exhibiting hunting behavior, could be worth documenting. Elena finished securing her spray skirt to her kayak. "Just don't get too close if you find them. Transients are a different animal altogether," says the woman who followed that humpback within 10 meters last summer, Michael retorted with a grin. "That was different. It approached me." Michael checked his waterproof bag containing his camera, GPS, marine radio, flares, and first aid kit. Everything secured. His phone went into a waterproof case attached to his life vest, easily accessible for photos, but protected from the elements. "Ready?" he asked, positioning himself to launch. Elena nodded, already sliding her kayak into the water. "Race you to the first marker?" Michael laughed. Some things never change. The two pushed off from shore, their paddles cutting through the glassy water in perfect synchronicity. The harbor gradually receded behind them as they navigated around the moored vessels and out toward the open channel. The world simplified on the water. Each paddle stroke became a meditation, the rhythmic splash a metronome keeping time with his breathing. This was why Michael came out here weekend after weekend, even when the weather turned hostile. The ocean had a way of stripping away complexity, reducing existence to its fundamental elements. They paddled in companionable silence for nearly an hour, occasionally pointing out a curious harbor seal or a soaring bald eagle. The morning sun broke through the cloud cover intermittently, casting golden patches across the water's surface. As they approached the rocky outcroppings of Speeden Island, Elena checked her watch. "This is where I leave you to your adventures," she said, pausing her paddling. "Remember our deal?" Michael nodded. "Check in by radio every 2 hours, and I'll text when I'm heading back. And don't take unnecessary risks," she added firmly. "If those transients are in active hunting mode, keep your distance. Your fancy camera lens can zoom, use it." "Yes, Mom," Michael replied with an exaggerated eye roll. Elena's expression grew serious. "I mean it, Mike. I've seen how you get when you're tracking. You lose awareness of everything else." "I'll be careful," he assured her, dropping the joking tone. "Standard protocol. No closer than 200 yards if they're traveling, 400 if they're feeding or with calves." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good hunting, then. Get some shots that will impress the grant committee." "Will do. Tell them we need that new hydrophone array if they want any decent acoustic data next season." With a final wave, Elena turned her kayak back toward Roach Harbor, her powerful strokes quickly carrying her away. Michael watched until she rounded the small peninsula, then checked his GPS, plotting his course toward Boundary Pass. The morning stretched before him, open water, solitude, and the promise of discovery. Perfect. Michael adjusted his course, slightly northwest, his paddle dipping into the increasingly choppy water as he left the sheltered area behind. 2 hours into his solo journey, Michael had settled into a rhythm. The scattered clouds had consolidated into a uniform gray ceiling, but without threatening immediate rain. The water conditions remained favorable, gentle swells with minimal whitecaps, allowing him to maintain a steady pace as he navigated the deeper channels between islands. He'd seen plenty of harbor seals, their curious faces popping up to observe him before disappearing beneath the surface. A small group of Dow's porpoises had briefly escorted him, their black and white bodies arcing gracefully through the water alongside his kayak. But no sign of orcas, resident or transient. Michael checked his position on the GPS. He was approaching the international boundary between US and Canadian waters, the invisible line cutting through the Harrow Strait. To the north, the shores of Saturna Island, British Columbia, were visible in the distance. He was making good time, perhaps too good. At this rate, he'd reach his planned turnaround point earlier than expected. Keeping his promise to Elena, he retrieved his marine radio. "Elena, this is Michael. Checking in. Over." The radio crackled with static before her voice came through. "Reading you, Mike. Position? Over. About 2 miles northeast of East Point, heading toward Boundary Pass, weather holding. No whale sightings yet. Over." "Copy that. Nothing from the spotters network either. Keep your eyes open and check back in 2 hours. Over." "Will do. Over and out." Michael secured the radio and took a long drink from his hydration pack. The exercise had warmed him despite the chill air, and he adjusted his neoprene hood, pushing it back slightly to release some heat. As he resumed paddling, something caught his attention, a change in the water ahead. Nothing obvious, just a subtle disturbance in the pattern of the swells. Instinct born from thousands of hours on the water made him pause, letting his kayak drift as he scanned the horizon. There, about half a mile ahead, a splash and a dark shape breaking the surface, momentarily before disappearing. Michael's heart rate quickened. He reached for his binoculars, focusing on the area where he'd seen movement. For several long moments, nothing. Then a tall, straight dorsal fin sliced through the surface, unmistakably Orca. As he watched, 2 more fins appeared nearby, moving in a coordinated pattern. Transients, almost certainly. The dorsal fin of the largest, presumably a male, stood at least 6 feet tall, its tip slightly curved. The others appeared to be females or juveniles, their fins shorter and more curved. Michael reached for his camera, capturing a series of shots as the orcas surfaced and dove. Through the viewfinder, he counted a total of 5 animals, a typical family group for Big's killer whales. His trained eye noted their pattern of movement, not the casual, meandering travel of orcas simply passing through, but the purposeful, coordinated movements of hunters. They were hunting, and that made this encounter particularly valuable from a research perspective. Documented observations of transient hunting behaviors were relatively rare, especially from the water level perspective his kayak afforded. Michael checked his position again, calculating the orca's direction of travel. They appeared to be moving northeast, deeper into the pass. If he adjusted his course slightly, he could parallel their path while maintaining a respectful and safe distance. The responsible choice would be to maintain his original course, letting the orcas continue without his presence potentially influencing their behavior. But the researcher in him argued that this was too valuable an opportunity to pass up. He could stay well outside the minimum distance guidelines while still collecting useful, observational data. After a moment's hesitation, Michael made his decision. He would follow, but cautiously, keeping at least 400 yards between himself and the hunting pod. He'd position himself to observe without interfering, documenting their behaviors for his research. He began paddling again, adjusting his course to run parallel to the orca's path. The animals moved with surprising speed, forcing Michael to increase his pace to keep them in view. Through his binoculars, he watched as they executed a series of coordinated dives, communicating through some invisible means to coordinate their movements. For nearly 30 minutes, Michael tracked the pod from a distance, snapping photos whenever they surfaced. They appeared to be searching rather than actively pursuing prey, covering substantial territory in a grid-like pattern. This was consistent with transient hunting strategies, methodical searches followed by explosive bursts of speed when prey was detected. As Michael watched, the orca's behavior suddenly changed. The spread-out search pattern collapsed as all 5 animals converged at a point about a quarter-mile ahead of him. Their surfacing became more frequent and energetic, water splashing as their massive bodies partially emerged during sharp turns. They'd found something. Michael's hands trembled slightly with excitement as he raised his camera again, capturing the intense hunting sequence unfolding before him. Through the lens, he spotted their target, a harbor seal attempting to escape by hugging close to a small rocky islet that barely broke the surface at high tide. The hunt was brief and efficient. The orcas worked in perfect coordination, cutting off the seal's escape routes. The largest male hung back initially, while 2 smaller orcas herded the seal toward the waiting jaws of another. A splash, a brief struggle, and it was over. The water churned as the orcas shared their prize beneath the surface. Michael lowered his camera, feeling the familiar mix of emotions these observations always evoked. Awe at the orca's intelligent hunting strategies, a scientist's satisfaction at documenting natural behaviors, and the more complicated human empathy for the seal. Nature was neither cruel nor kind, he reminded himself. It simply was. He checked his watch, surprised to find that nearly an hour had passed since he'd first spotted the pod. The orcas were now engaged in what appeared to be social behavior after their successful hunt, rolling at the surface, spy-hopping to look around, their movement patterns looser and less directed. This would be the ideal time to begin heading back. He'd witnessed a complete hunting sequence, captured excellent photos, and maintained a responsible distance throughout. Elena would be impressed with his restraint, he thought with a small smile. As Michael prepared to turn his kayak southward, he noticed a change in the orca's behavior. The playful post-hunt activities ceased abruptly, and the pod arranged themselves in a line facing in his direction. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down Michael's spine. He'd never seen this behavior before, not directed toward a boat or kayak. Through his binoculars, he could see their large heads partially emerged, eye patches visible as they appeared to stare directly at him. They'd noticed him. Michael remained, still his paddle across his lap, watching as the orcas seemed to confer with one another. After a moment, they submerged simultaneously, leaving the surface undisturbed. He scanned the water anxiously, trying to determine which direction they'd gone. Nothing broke the surface for long seconds that stretched into a minute, then 2. Perhaps they'd simply continued on their way, diving deep to hunt again or moving to another area. Still, uneasiness prickled at the back of Michael's neck. He decided it was definitely time to head back, giving the area where he'd last seen the orcas a wide berth. He dipped his paddle into the water and began the long journey back towards San Juan Island, checking frequently over his shoulder. The encounter had been remarkable. Exactly the kind of observation opportunity he'd hoped for when setting out this morning. As he paddled, Michael mentally composed the notes he would add to the research database. The pod composition, their hunting techniques, the prey selection, all valuable data points. He was so absorbed in these thoughts that he almost missed the subtle change in the water pressure beneath his kayak. Something large was moving below him. Michael froze, his paddle half submerged. A massive dark shape glided beneath his kayak, close enough that he could make out the distinctive white patches as it passed silently under the hull. An adult orca, at least 20 feet long, its movement deliberate and controlled. His breath caught in his throat. In 20 years of kayaking these waters, he'd never had an orca pass directly beneath him. The encounter wasn't unprecedented. Orcas occasionally investigated boats and kayaks out of curiosity, but it was rare, especially with transients. Before Michael could process this development, more shadows appeared in the water around him. The entire pod had circled back, surrounding his position. They maintained their distance for now, swimming in a loose ring around his kayak, surfacing occasionally to eye him before diving again. The behavior wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't normal either. Transient orcas typically showed minimal interest in boats, focusing instead on hunting marine mammals. This deliberate investigation was unusual. Michael's scientific curiosity battled with growing apprehension. He knew the statistics. There had never been a fatal orca attack on a human in the wild. The few documented attacks were likely misidentifications or play behaviors gone wrong. These were intelligent predators, capable of distinguishing humans from their natural prey. And yet, these were hunters who had just made a kill. They were transients, mammal eaters, not the fish-eating residents he was more familiar with. And from their perspective, his kayak might resemble a small seal or sea lion, especially from below. Michael carefully reached for his marine radio, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Elena, this is Michael. Do you copy? Over." His voice sounded strained even to his own ears. Static answered him. He was too far out, in a dead zone between islands where the signal couldn't reach back to Friday Harbor. The largest male orca surfaced about 30 yards to his right, exhaling a misty breath that carried across the water. Its massive dorsal fin stood like a black sail as it regarded Michael with an eye that seemed unnervingly intelligent. Slowly, keeping his movements smooth to avoid any sudden actions that might trigger a predatory response, Michael began paddling. Not toward the orcas, not away from them, but parallel to their circle, hoping to gradually increase the distance while not appearing to flee, which might stimulate a chase instinct. The pod adjusted their position, maintaining the same distance. They weren't threatening him, Michael told himself, just curious, investigating an unusual object in their territory. But as he continued his careful paddling, the circle began to tighten. The orcas' surfacing became more frequent, their exhalations louder, more forceful. The largest male slapped its tail on the surface, a behavior that could indicate aggression or simply be a communication to the rest of the pod. Michael's scientific mind continued cataloging these behaviors, even as his instincts screamed for him to paddle faster, to try to reach the nearest shoreline, a small uninhabited island about a half-mile away. But that would mean crossing directly through the narrowing circle of orcas, and his training told him that making a direct approach toward large marine mammals was never advisable. One of the smaller orcas suddenly dived beneath his kayak again, this time close enough that Michael felt the vessel lift slightly on the pressure wave of its passing. As it emerged on the other side, it rolled to its side, its white eye patch visible as it seemed to study him. The behavior was similar to how they'd assessed the seal before attacking. Michael's heart pounded against his ribcage. This wasn't normal investigative behavior anymore. Something had changed in the pod's dynamics. They were no longer simply curious, they were testing, probing, evaluating. He needed to reach shallower water, where the massive orcas would be less maneuverable. The small island ahead had a gradually sloping shore according to his mental map of the area. If he could reach those shallows, Abandoning his cautious parallel course, Michael turned his kayak toward the island and began paddling with purpose, trying to find the balance between speed and avoiding any erratic movements that might trigger a predatory response. The reaction was immediate. Two of the orcas intercepted his new course, surfacing directly in his path. Michael swerved to avoid them, his paddle digging deep into the water as adrenaline surged through his system. The pod's pattern changed again, no longer a circle but now a coordinated pursuit. Just as they had with the seal, they were cutting off his escape routes, herding him toward the open water of the pass, away from safety, away from witnesses, away from help. Michael abandoned any pretense of calm, scientific observation. This was no longer an encounter, it was becoming a hunt, and he was the prey. He dug his paddle into the water with renewed urgency, changing direction repeatedly, trying to break through the orca's formation. Each attempt was blocked, the massive black and white bodies appearing with uncanny anticipation of his moves. They weren't touching his kayak, not yet, but they were controlling his movement with precision that spoke to their intelligence as apex predators. Michael reached again for his radio, trying a different channel. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is kayaker Michael Barrett near Boundary Pass. I am being pursued by a pod of orcas showing aggressive behavior. Request immediate assistance, over." Again, nothing but static. He was too far from any receivers, in a notorious dead zone for radio transmission. A hard bump from beneath nearly capsized his kayak. Michael's years of experience allowed him to brace instinctively, keeping the craft upright, but his paddle slipped from his grasp in the process. It floated tantalizingly just out of reach. Before he could attempt to retrieve it, one of the orcas surfaced alongside the paddle and, with a flick of its massive head, sent it spinning away across the water. An intentional act. There was no mistaking it. Michael's blood ran cold as the implications set in. The orcas weren't just herding him anymore, they were actively working to render him helpless. His spare paddle was secured to the deck behind him, but reaching for it would require shifting his weight precariously. The largest male orca approached his kayak directly now, its massive body creating a bow wave that rocked the small craft. It halted just yards away, raising its head vertically in a spy-hop maneuver. For a heart-stopping moment, Michael found himself staring directly into an eye the size of his fist, dark, intelligent, and utterly alien. There was no malice in that gaze, but no mercy either. Only the cold calculation of a predator that had hunted these waters for millennia before humans had ever ventured upon them. The male sank beneath the surface. Michael fumbled for his spare paddle, his hands shaking as he worked to detach it from its securing straps. Just as his fingers closed around it, the water beneath his kayak erupted. The male orca had surged from the depths, not directly beneath the kayak but alongside it, creating a massive pressure wave that lifted the starboard side. The kayak tilted precariously, then capsized completely, dumping Michael into the frigid October waters of the Salish Sea. The shock of immersion stole his breath despite the protection of his dry suit. Michael fought to orient himself, years of training kicking in as he pushed away from the overturned kayak. Surface. He needed to reach the surface. His head broke the water, and he gasped a desperate breath, immediately looking for the approaching orcas. Nothing. The surface around him was empty, unnaturally calm. They were beneath him. Michael tried to pull himself back onto his overturned kayak, knowing that getting his body out of the water was his only chance. His numb fingers scrabbled at the slick hull, finding purchase on the bungee cords crisscrossing the deck. Just as he began to pull himself up, something large brushed against his legs. Not a collision, but a passing touch, almost gentle, but terrifying in its implications. They were testing him, as they would test any novel prey. With desperate strength, Michael hauled himself partially onto the overturned hull, his legs still dangling in the water. He needed to flip the kayak back over, but that would require returning fully to the water. The decision was made for him when a more forceful nudge nearly dislodged him from his precarious position. One of the smaller orcas had bumped the kayak, from below its dark body visible just beneath the surface. Michael clung to the kayak, his mind racing. If he stayed here, half out of the water, he might eventually die of hypothermia. But at least he had a chance. If he returned fully to the water to attempt to right his kayak, he would be completely vulnerable. Another bump, harder this time. From the opposite side, the orcas were coordinating, testing the stability of his makeshift raft. The realization struck him with horrifying clarity. They were learning, figuring out how to dislodge him from the overturned kayak. As if confirming his thoughts, two of the orcas surfaced on opposite sides of the kayak, then dove simultaneously. The pressure wave from their powerful tail strokes rocked the vessel violently, nearly throwing Michael back into the water. They were going to flip him off. It was just a matter of time. Michael clung more tightly to the bungee cords, the rough material cutting into his palms. His legs were going numb from the cold water despite his dry suit, his strength already beginning to ebb. The largest male surfaced about 20 yards away, watching, waiting. Michael had the unsettling feeling it was directing the others, coordinating their efforts. Another synchronized dive, another violent rocking. Michael's grip slipped, one hand losing purchase on the wet cords. He scrabbled desperately, regaining his hold, just as a third assault came from directly beneath, a powerful upward push that lifted the entire kayak momentarily out of the water. The kayak crashed back down, and this time Michael couldn't maintain his grip. He slid sideways into the water, his body responding sluggishly as cold sapped his strength. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he tread water, turning in a circle to try to keep track of the orcas, nothing visible at the surface. They had all submerged, hunting. Michael made a desperate lunge for the kayak, now drifting several feet away. His arms felt leaden, his movements slowed by the constricting cold and the drag of the water against his clothing. Something solid brushed his leg again, more firmly this time. Not a bump, but a rub, like a cat might rub against furniture. Testing texture, testing consistency, testing prey. Michael kicked out instinctively, his foot connecting with something solid yet yielding, a mistake. In his panic, he had done the one thing all marine guidelines warned against. He had struck a wild orca. The water around him exploded into frenzied activity. Dark shapes circled rapidly, their movements no longer measured and cautious, but charged with predatory energy. The pod had made a decision. As Michael struggled toward his drifting kayak, a massive form surged up from below, not beneath him, but beneath the kayak itself. The male orca breached partially, its head and upper body rising out of the water with the kayak balanced upon its rostrum. For a suspended moment, the tableau held, the massive black and white predator seeming to showcase its strength as it lifted the 16-foot kayak partially clear of the water. Then, with a powerful twist of its massive body, the orca threw the kayak aside. She had crashed down 15 yards away, the impact cracking the hull audibly. The message couldn't have been clearer. There would be no escape that way. Michael tread water, his movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as hypothermia began to set in despite his protective gear. The cold was an enemy as deadly as the circling predators, and they seemed to understand this, keeping their distance now, surfacing occasionally to monitor his condition. They were waiting for him to weaken. The realization came with a strange sense of professional admiration, even through his terror. This was advanced hunting behavior, not the quick, brutal efficiency they had shown with the seal, but a calculated strategy, adapted for an unusual prey item that might pose risks if tackled, while at full strength. Michael fought to remain calm, to think rationally through the fog of cold and fear. His survival training told him to float as much as possible, to conserve energy, but every instinct screamed that remaining passive in the water was surrendering to the waiting predators. The shore of the small island was still visible, perhaps a quarter-mile away now. An impossible distance given his condition and the circling orcas, but staying here meant certain death. Decision made, Michael began swimming toward the island with slow, energy-conserving strokes. He had no illusions about outpacing the orcas, but movement would generate heat, potentially staving off the worst effects of hypothermia long enough for what? Rescue? No one knew exactly where he was. His radio was lost with his kayak. His cell phone, though in a waterproof case, would have no signal out here. As he swam, the orcas adjusted their pattern, shadowing his movements, but not interfering. Yet. Michael had covered perhaps 50 yards when the first direct contact came. A forceful nudge against his side, nearly rolling him in the water. He righted himself, kicking harder, pushing through the shock of the encounter. Another bump from behind this time, pushing him forward with alarming force. The orcas were done waiting. The hunt was entering its final phase. Something clamped around Michael's calf, not with the full crushing force those powerful jaws were capable of, but firmly enough to drag him under the surface. Instinctive terror gave him a burst of strength, and he kicked violently, breaking free and surging back to the surface with a desperate gasp. The taste of blood mingled with salt water told him the orca's teeth had penetrated his dry suit and broken skin. The predators would smell it, triggering feeding instincts that might overwhelm even their caution toward an unfamiliar prey. Michael tried to keep moving, but his injured leg responded poorly, trailing uselessly behind him. Blood streamed through the torn neoprene, creating a thin cloud in the water around him. The orca's movements became more agitated, their surfacing more frequent as they responded to the scent of blood. They circled closer, their massive bodies occasionally brushing against him, jostling him in the water like cats playing with an injured mouse. The largest male approached again, this time swimming directly at Michael with jaws slightly parted, revealing rows of conical teeth designed for gripping struggling prey. At the last possible moment it veered aside, its massive body passing close enough that Michael could have touched the white eye patch. A test pass. They were still assessing, still calculating the risk-reward ratio of this unusual prey. But they were growing bolder, their passes closer, their bumps more forceful. The decision point was approaching, for both hunter and hunted. Michael's options had dwindled to a single desperate chance. The orcas were intelligently cautious, but they were also curious. Perhaps he could use that curiosity, that hesitation, to buy precious seconds. The next time one of the smaller orcas approached, Michael didn't flinch away. Instead, he twisted in the water to face it directly and slapped his palm hard against the surface, creating a sharp sound and a splash. The orca veered off, surprised by the unexpected aggression from what had been weakening prey. The others surfaced, their exhalations coming in sharp, interested bursts as they reassessed. Michael repeated the action when another approached, adding a harsh shout that tore from his throat. Again, the orca turned aside, more from surprise than fear. It wouldn't work for long. These were apex predators, intelligent and adaptable, but every second he remained alive was another second closer to what? The possibility of rescue seemed increasingly remote. As if to underscore the futility of his resistance, the largest male suddenly accelerated toward him. There was no hesitation in its approach this time, no cautious assessment. Its enormous body carved through the water with terrifying speed, jaws opening wide. Michael had time for one final, desperate thought. After all his years studying these magnificent predators, there was a brutal poetry in becoming part of the food chain he had spent his life documenting. Then, incredibly, the male swerved at the last possible instant, its massive body creating a pressure wave that tumbled Michael through the water. As he fought back to the surface, gasping, he glimpsed the reason for the orca's abrupt change in behavior. A low, powerful rumble vibrated through the water, the unmistakable sound of a boat engine approaching at high speed. The orcas reacted immediately, their hunting formation dissolving as they regrouped several dozen yards away, their tall dorsal fins visible as they surfaced to assess this new development. Michael turned toward the sound, his vision blurring from cold and exhaustion. A white vessel was approaching rapidly, its outline growing clearer by the second. A Coast Guard response boat, its orange stripe vivid against the white hull. The radio. Someone had heard his mayday after all, or perhaps Elena had raised the Orca alarm when he missed his check-in. The orcas remained visible at the surface, watching as the Coast Guard vessel closed the distance. They showed no fear of the approaching boat, but their hunting behavior had ceased. The pod gathered in a tight formation, the juveniles positioned in the center, protected by the adults. As the Coast Guard boat slowed its approach, a figure in a bright orange survival suit prepared to deploy over the side. The boat maneuvered, carefully positioning itself between Michael and the watching orcas. "Hold on, sir, we're coming to you." The voice carried across the water, professional but urgent. With his remaining strength, Michael raised an arm to signal his position. The simple movement sent pain lancing through muscles cramped from cold and exertion. The rescue swimmer entered the water with practiced efficiency, securing a line to the boat before striking out toward Michael with powerful strokes. Behind him, another Coast Guard officer kept watch on the orcas, tracking their position with binoculars. "I've got you," the swimmer said as he reached Michael, quickly assessing his condition. "Hypothermia, lacerations to the right leg. Can you help me get this harness on you?" Michael nodded weakly, struggling to coordinate his movements as the swimmer efficiently secured a rescue harness around his chest. "Orcas," Michael managed to rasp, gesturing toward where the pod still watched. "We see them," the swimmer replied tersely. "They haven't approached since we arrived. Just hold still now." A sharp tug on the line, and they began moving toward the boat, the swimmer supporting Michael's weight as they were drawn through the water. The orcas remained in their tight formation, their tall dorsal fins unwavering sentinels against the gray horizon. Hands reached down to lift Michael from the water, strong arms hauling him over the gunwale and onto the deck of the Coast Guard vessel. The sudden absence of the ocean's grip left him feeling strangely bereft, as though a fundamental connection had been severed. "Get him below. Start warming protocols," a commanding voice ordered. "Anderson, keep eyes on those orcas. If they approach, increase engine speed." As they carried him toward the cabin, Michael twisted to look back at the pod. They remained in place, watching the boat with those intelligent, inscrutable eyes. The largest, male, lifted its head in a spy hop, as if making a final assessment of the prey that had escaped. Then, with synchronized grace, the entire pod submerged, leaving nothing but expanding ripples on the surface of the Salish Sea. The fluorescent lights of San Juan Island Medical Center cast a harsh glow over Michael's pale face as Dr. Reynolds examined the lacerations on his right calf. 26 stitches had closed the deepest wound, but the muscle damage would take longer to heal. "You're incredibly lucky," the doctor said, not for the first time since Michael had been brought in 3 hours earlier. "The bite pattern suggests the orca was being cautious. A full-force bite would have severed the limb entirely." Michael nodded absently, his mind still partially adrift in the cold waters of Boundary Pass. "They were testing me," he murmured, "learning what I was, how I would respond." Dr. Reynolds gave him a concerned look. "Your body temperature is almost back to normal, but we'll need to keep you overnight for observation. There's risk of secondary infection from marine bacteria in those bite wounds." From the doorway, Elena's voice interrupted, tight with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "He's staying longer than overnight if I have anything to say about it." She entered the examination room, her normally composed features strained. Behind her, a uniformed Coast Guard officer waited respectfully. "Ms. Yamamoto has been filling us in on your experience level," the officer said, stepping forward. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Wallace. When you're feeling up to it, we'd like to get a full statement about the incident. Intentional orca aggression toward humans is nearly unprecedented." "Not aggression," Michael corrected automatically, the scientist in him asserting itself even through the trauma. "Predation. There's a difference." He paused, collecting his scattered thoughts. "They were hunting. I was potential prey. When they realized I wasn't their usual food source, they became curious, then experimental." "You're saying they were deliberately testing to see if you were edible?" Wallace asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "They're intelligent predators with problem-solving abilities," Michael replied. "When they encounter novel potential prey, they assess risk versus reward. That's why they were so cautious. I wasn't a seal or sea lion, their typical mammalian prey. I was something new, something unknown." Elena stepped closer to the examination table, her hand coming to rest near his, but not quite touching. Mike, you don't need to analyze this right now. You need to rest. The research value is significant, Michael insisted, a tremor entering his voice despite his attempt at professional detachment. Documented predatory behavior toward humans could help us understand. Michael, Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. You almost died out there. This isn't just data. The simple statement broke through his fragile composure. Michael's breath caught, his hands beginning to shake as the full emotional impact of his experience finally penetrated the protective numbness that had enveloped him since his rescue. I was prey, he whispered, the scientific terminology suddenly inadequate to contain the primal terror of the experience. I spent my whole life studying them, respecting them, advocating for their protection, and in the end, I was just meat to them. Potential calories. Dr. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Elena. I'm going to give you something mild for anxiety, he said, preparing a syringe. It won't knock you out, but it will help take the edge off while your mind processes the trauma. Michael barely nodded, lost in the memory of that cold, intelligent eye studying him from just yards away, an eye belonging to a mind so alien, so fundamentally different in its priorities and perceptions, that all his years of research had ultimately failed to bridge the gap in understanding. The medication spread a gentle warmth through his veins, softening the sharp edges of his thoughts without dulling them completely. Lieutenant Commander Wallace pulled up a chair. I know this is difficult, he said, his voice more compassionate. Now, but your experience could help prevent similar incidents. Can you walk me through what happened, starting from when you first spotted the orcas? Michael closed his eyes briefly, then began recounting the events of the morning. The initial excitement of spotting the transient pod, the hunting behavior he had observed, the moment when their attention had shifted to him. As he described the coordinated testing behaviors, the strategic bumps, the way they had disabled. His kayak, the controlled bite that could have been lethal but wasn't. Wallace took detailed notes. Eleanor remained silent, her face growing increasingly pale. So, in your professional opinion, Wallace said when Michael finished his account, this wasn't random aggression or curiosity gone wrong. This was a deliberate, coordinated hunting effort. Yes, Michael confirmed, the single syllable heavy with implications for coastal recreation in Orca territories. They identified me as potential prey, assessed the risk I posed, and made a calculated decision to attempt predation. The fact that they didn't immediately apply lethal force suggests they were still in the testing phase when the Coast Guard arrived. Wallace nodded gravely. We'll need to issue updated guidelines for kayakers and paddleboarders in areas with known transient orca activity. He stood, tucking his notepad away. Thank you, Dr. Barrett. Get some rest. We may have follow-up questions once our marine mammal specialists review your statement. After the officer departed, Elena pulled her chair closer to Michael's bed. For several long moments, neither spoke. The antiseptic hospital silence, broken only by the soft beep of monitoring equipment. I heard your mayday, Elena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Partial transmission, enough to know you were in trouble but not your position. When you missed your check-in, she trailed off, swallowing hard. You raised the alarm, Michael finished for her. You saved my life. Elena shook her head. The Coast Guard saved your life. I just made the call when you were 15 minutes late. Standard protocol, like we always agreed. Michael reached for her hand, needing the human connection to anchor him against the memory of those alien eyes, studying him from the water. Thank you. Her fingers tightened around his. What happens now, Mike? The question encompassed far more than his medical recovery, and they both knew it. How does a marine biologist who has dedicated his life to studying and protecting orcas reconcile being hunted by the very creatures he had championed? How does a kayaker who found his deepest peace on the water return to that environment after experiencing its ultimate terror? I don't know, Michael admitted, the words catching in his throat. I keep seeing them, Elena. Not just during the attack, but before, all those years of observing them, photographing them, fighting for their protection. And I still believe in that work, I do, but now there's this other image overlaid on all of it. That eye watching me, calculating, deciding whether I was worth the effort to kill. It's going to take time, Elena said softly. "No one expects you to have this figured out today or tomorrow or next month." Michael stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the competing truths within him. His scientific understanding of predator behavior that framed the attack as natural and without malice, and the profound visceral trauma of being hunted that had shattered his perception of his place in the marine ecosystem he had studied for decades. "The male," he said suddenly. "The big one that was coordinating the others. I recognized his dorsal fin from our research database, T-137A. We've been tracking him for 11 years. Elena's expression softened with understanding. This was how Michael would begin processing, through the familiar framework of scientific observation and data, slowly integrating the personal trauma into his professional knowledge. "Do you want me to pull his file when I get back to the center?" she asked. Michael nodded. "I need to understand their movement patterns better. This pod doesn't usually come this far into the Salish Sea this time of year. Something changed. Something brought them here into my path." "Nothing brought them into your path, Mike," Elena said gently. "You were in their environment. That's the reality we've always known, but rarely had to confront directly." The truth of her statement settled heavily between them. For all their research, all their careful tracking and observation, humans remained visitors in the marine world, tolerated by its apex predators until, in rare instances like Michael's, they became targets of opportunity. Dr. Reynolds returned, checking Michael's vitals and adjusting his IV medication. "You should try to sleep," he advised. "Your body needs rest to heal, and your mind needs downtime to process." But sleep, when it finally came hours later, brought no respite. In his dreams, Michael was back in the water, surrounded by massive shadows that circled with deliberate purpose. Only in the dreamscape, the Coast Guard never arrived. The largest shadow approached, jaws opening to reveal rows of conical teeth, the massive body accelerating in the final attack run. Michael jerked awake with a strangled cry, his heart monitor beeping rapidly. A night nurse appeared at his door, concern etched on her features. "Just a dream," he assured her, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. As he lay awake, watching dawn gradually illuminate his hospital room, Michael confronted the truth he had been avoiding since his rescue. Something fundamental had changed within him. The comfortable certainties that had defined his life's work, his understanding of his place in the marine environment, his relationship with the creatures he studied, had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer just an observer, a scientist, cataloging behaviors from a position of detached security. He had become part of the data set, his own blood and terror now variables in the complex equation of predator-prey dynamics that he had studied with such passionate objectivity for decades. The first watery sunlight of morning found him still, awake, staring out the window toward the harbor where his journey had begun the previous day. Somewhere out there, beyond the sheltered waters of Friday Harbor, T-137A and his pod continued their eternal patrol of the Salish Sea's cold, deep channels. Hunting, surviving, utterly indifferent to the profound disruption they had caused in the life of the human who had briefly entered their world, not as an observer but as prey. 6 weeks later, Michael stood at the edge of the same dock where he had launched his kayak on that fateful October morning. The December air was brutally cold, crystallizing his breath into white plumes that dissipated quickly in the winter sunshine. His right leg still ached where the orca's teeth had torn through muscle, the physical therapy only partially successful in restoring his former strength and flexibility. The doctors were optimistic about eventual recovery, but had warned him that some level of permanent impairment was likely. The psychological wounds ran deeper. Michael hadn't been on the water since the attack, not even on the small research vessels that regularly departed from the Institute's private dock. The mere thought of being surrounded by the cold, dark waters of the Salish Sea triggered panic attacks that left him gasping for breath, his heart racing as though he were back in that moment of primal terror. Elena approached from behind, her footsteps deliberately heavy on the wooden planks to avoid startling him. She had become carefully attuned to his triggers over the past weeks, adapting her behavior with the same methodical thoughtfulness she brought to her research. "The T-137 pod was spotted near Victoria yesterday," she said, stopping beside him at the dock's edge. They're moving south toward the open Pacific. Michael nodded, unsurprised. The transients rarely stayed in one area for long, following the migratory patterns of their prey throughout the coastal waters of the Pacific Northwest. Their encounter with him had been just one brief episode in their ceaseless journey, significant to him, but likely already forgotten by the intelligent predators. The paper's been accepted, Elena continued, referring to the research article they had co-authored documenting the attack. Predatory behavior of Big's killer whales, Orca, toward human kayaker. Case study and implications for water safety guidelines. The peer reviewers were impressed with the detailed behavioral analysis. When does it publish? Michael asked, his voice flat. March issue of Marine Mammal Science. There's already media interest. Michael grimaced. In the weeks following the attack, he had become an unwilling celebrity in marine biology circles and beyond. The incident represented one of the most thoroughly documented cases of intentional predatory behavior by orcas toward a human. Valuable data for the scientific community, but a source of ongoing trauma for the man who had lived through it. I'm not doing interviews, he said firmly. This was a boundary he had established early and maintained rigorously, despite pressure from various media outlets eager to sensationalize his experience. I know, Elena assured him. The Institute's PR team will handle any press inquiries. Your name is on the paper because your observations have scientific value, but no one expects you to become the public face of this. Michael stared out at the water, its surface glittering in the winter sunlight. Once, he had found peace in that vista, the ever-changing patterns of light and shadow, the promise of encounters with the marine life he had dedicated his career to studying. Now he saw only potential danger lurking beneath the deceptively beautiful surface. I've been offered the position at the Seattle Aquarium, he said, after a long silence. Senior Research Coordinator, all land-based work. Elena nodded slowly. They had discussed this possibility over the past few weeks, as it became increasingly clear that Michael's recovery, particularly his psychological recovery, would require significant changes to his professional responsibilities. It's a good position, she said carefully. Your expertise would be valuable there. It feels like running away, Michael admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. 20 years studying. These animals in the wild, advocating for their protection, educating the public about their importance to the ecosystem, and now I can't even look at the water without seeing those eyes watching me, calculating whether I was worth killing. Elena was silent for a moment, choosing her words with characteristic thoughtfulness. Moving to a land-based position isn't running away, Mike. It's adapting to changed circumstances. Evolution, not retreat. The scientific framing was deliberate, an appeal to the rational part of his mind that still functioned beneath the layers of trauma. Michael recognized the strategy, but appreciated it nonetheless. The research continues, Elena added. Your experience, as horrible as it was, has actually advanced our understanding of transient hunting behaviors. The paper we've written will help update safety protocols for kayakers and paddleboarders throughout the region. Lives could be saved because of what you observed and documented. Michael's hands tightened on the dock railing. I know all that intellectually, but every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water, watching them systematically disable my kayak, test my defenses, coordinate their approaches. I can still feel those teeth closing around my leg. Not to kill, not yet, but to assess, to gather data. He laughed hollowly. They were being good scientists in their way. Elena didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. She understood, perhaps, better than anyone, the complex interplay of scientific respect and visceral terror that defined Michael's relationship with orcas now. What does Dr. Chen say? She asked instead, referring to the trauma specialist Michael had been seeing weekly since the incident. That integration takes time. That it's normal to experience profound shifts in perspective after survival events. That eventually, the scientific understanding and the emotional experience will find some kind of equilibrium. Michael shook his head. But he also says some things change permanently, that I might never feel the same about the water or about the animals as I did before. A ferry horn sounded in the distance, its mournful note carrying across the harbor. Michael watched its white form cutting through the waters of the Sound, carrying passengers safely above the mysterious world below. "I'm taking the Seattle position," he said finally. "Starting in February, but I'm keeping my cabin here at TA, least for now." Elena nodded, understanding the significance of this compromise. Not a complete retreat from the environment that had shaped his life and career, but a strategic repositioning, a chance to heal while maintaining connection to the community and research that still mattered to him. "The door will always be open for you here," she said simply. "Whatever capacity you're comfortable with, whenever you're ready." Michael took a deep breath of the cold December air, letting it fill his lungs completely before exhaling slowly. A technique his therapist had taught him for grounding himself. In the present moment, when memories of the attack threatened to overwhelm him. "I need to see them again," he said suddenly, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. "Not now, not soon, but eventually. I need to see orcas from a safe vantage point, to begin rebuilding my mental framework, to see them as the animals I studied for 20 years, not just as the predators that hunted me." The research center at the aquarium has an observation vessel, Elena suggested tentatively. "Larger, more stable when you're ready." Michael nodded, the idea settling into place as a distant but necessary goal on his path to recovery. Not a return to his former relationship with the water and its apex predators. That innocence was irretrievably lost, but perhaps a new understanding, tempered by respect not just for the orca's intelligence and social complexity, but for their fundamental nature as predators who had evolved to test, assess, and kill with cool efficiency. A nature he had always understood intellectually, but now knew viscerally, written in the scars on his leg and the deeper ones on his psyche. "One day at a time," he murmured, echoing his therapist's constant refrain. Together, they turned from the water's edge and walked back toward the research center, leaving behind the glittering expanse of the Salish Sea, where miles away in the deeper channels to the west, the T-137 pod continued their eternal hunt, magnificent, intelligent, and utterly wild, indifferent to the human who now carried their mark upon his body and within his mind. In the cold winter sunlight, Michael's shadow stretched behind him across the weathered dock planks, a silhouette that appeared whole and undiminished to casual observation. But like the man who cast it, that shadow carried invisible fractures, lines where the experience of becoming prey had broken something that could be mended, but never made pristine again. As he reached the shore, Michael paused for one final glance back at the water. For a brief, disorienting moment, he thought he glimpsed a tall dorsal fin breaking the distant surface, an impossibility given the T-137 pod's documented position near Victoria, a phantom born of traumatic memory rather than current reality. He blinked, and the illusion vanished, leaving only the empty water glittering in the pale December sun. With deliberate effort, Michael turned away from the sight and continued his slow walk back to solid ground, each step a small victory in the long journey of recovery that stretched before him, a journey that would never return him to the person he had been before entering those cold waters, but might eventually lead to a new understanding of his place in the world. He had spent his life studying from a position of privilege that had, in one terrible moment, been stripped away forever. The orcas would continue their patrols of these waters long after his own brief existence had ended, their ancient bloodlines stretching into a future beyond human imagining. Michael Barrett would be forgotten by the predators that had so fundamentally altered his life. One brief encounter, in their ceaseless hunt across the cold, dark waters of the Salish Sea. But he would remember, and in that memory, in the knowledge gained at such personal cost, perhaps some deeper truth about humanity's place in the natural world might eventually be found, not as masters or even as stewards, but as participants in an ancient system that, despite all our technology and presumed dominance, could still reduce us in an instant to what we had always been beneath the veneer of civilization: prey.